Everchosen was a really interesting journey for me so far. As you know, I'm not that into competitions for a variety of reasons. To me, painting is mainly about having a good time and doing something you love. Ironically, painting something to a high standard with a deadline seems to be a really great spot to be in when you're trying to have fun. It forces you to focus your efforts and doesn't leave much room for self-doubt and second guessing. And at the end of the deadline, you have a miniature that you can call finished. I got to admit I was not sure whether or not to enter Everchosen because of all the circumstances like being a public and popular vote and a community event more than trying to find the actual best paint job. Also the risk of losing at the store level because certain aspects might appeal more to the public than what a painting jury might be looking for. But here we are, and I'm glad I entered, if only because I ended up with a finished display piece, the result showing currently on screen. I documented the creation of this piece as much as possible under the time restraint I had. I hope you enjoyed. Let's go. Starting from a plain black base coat, the first thing I want to do is the skin color, because it's the dominant area that will influence a lot of color choices for the rest of the miniature. I'm using English uniform because I knew it would appear again on other areas like the wooden parts, and I'm mixing in Carnage Red by Reaper and Rhinoxide. The result was a bit too intense for my taste, so I dialed it down a bit by adding Incubate Darkness. And yes, I know, I get a bit carried away when trying to find the right color, but these 5 colors are all I needed in the end for an interesting base color. It ended up being a bit too dark when it was dry. That's why I always say don't base your decisions on how to continue on wet colors. So I added pink to brighten the skin color and applied it on most of the skin, just leaving out the very shadows. To make the skin warmer and more lively, I added a bit of flat yellow to the mix and applied more selective layers. As you can see, this added a bit of warmth and everything started to look like a more credible skin color. As I mentioned initially, I only had roughly 6 days to finish my entry, and I could not film everything I painted because making sure the miniature is in focus and positioning for the camera slows me down a lot, so occasionally I only took step-by-step pictures. As always, you will soon be able to find all the full-length video tutorials as well as an extensive PDF painting guide for this miniature on my Patreon. You can find a link in the description. On such complex features like skin tones, the process is rarely a linear one for me, so it's typically a bit of a back and forth until I arrive at a mood and color tone I'm happy with. You can see that from picture 2, where I mostly care about values, to picture 3, where the interplay of warm midtones and brighter highlights becomes more evident. Then I gradually started to paint in features on the skin like wrinkles and lines. To me it is important to add details to elements that are plain. We are not limited to what has been sculpted. Miniatures are always open to interpretation and customization when we paint. Be bold and daring when it comes to this and you will be rewarded. I added a rust brown to the open wounds, which would be my base for the body fluids, and base coated the maggots, breaking through the abdomen in a neutral grey. Step by step, alternating between ivory and a mix of English uniform and yellow, I highlighted the maggots up to have variation in this area. I also darkened the burst skin areas by mixing in a bit of black. Next I was working on the green armor. My goal was a maximum of contrast in these reflections, so I started with a very dark green. It doesn't look very dark when it's wet, but as I said, always wait for colors to dry. I tested a few greens on the leg area until I was happy with the tone and started sketching in the reflection lines on the shoulder guard and the helmet. Painting is all about brush control in my opinion, and the right brush stroke in the correct situation is key. Here I'm dabbing on lines for the highlights, which simulates a burnished metal. On the helmet I do the same thing. Remember what I said about making plain surfaces more interesting by painting additional detail on?
Your world, you're the creator.
I'm painting on the highlights with lines again in the form of concentric circles that follow the shape of the helmet. Occasionally I switch back to the shoulder guard in order to keep both at the same value intensity. There's no real need for that, it's just something I always did and it helps me to keep track of the bigger picture. Back on the helmet I decided that I wanted to do secondary reflections with some micro painting, so I'm carefully scribbling on lines again to the left and to the right of the main reflection. My approach to painting nowadays that doesn't focus too much on smoothness and more on credible texture and contrast allows for the addition of highlights at any point. Like you can see here, where I'm adding an additional reflection line in an area that was a bit too plain. Again, I have a lot of videos about my painting philosophy on my Patreon, if that is something you're interested in. Adding some yellow to my highlight mix, I add more highlights. Adding some yellow to my highlight mix, I add more highlights. The yellow corresponds with the warmer midtones in the skin tones and ties both elements together. Of course, I also have to highlight the smaller reflection lines. Okay, let's add more reflections. There's not really an edge in the sculpt, but I feel like it would add additional interest to separate this into two plates by drawing a line. I used pale lichen to create scratches on the lower side of the shoulder guard. I wanted the horns to be black at the tips and I started highlighting them at the base. Using a mix of English uniform and black, I painted on the initial layers, creating line patterns in the horns. Again, interpretation and adding additional details by painting lines that are not sculpted. reinforcing some of the shadows with black before continuing with the next highlight, which was done with pure English uniform. Mixing in some ice yellow for the next highlights. Then it was time to highlight the black areas, which I quickly did with a mix of black and ivory. Using a mix of red, rhinox hide, some black and English uniform, I'm base coating the copper parts. There's a lot of different base mixes for copper that work. As long as there is some red in it, you'll be fine. For the highlights, I have the options of orange brown and the skin tone. The latter results in a bit more salmon, desaturated highlights, and orange brown obviously helps us to get some saturation back, which is why I alternate between them. Generally, I find copper and non-metallic metal a bit easier to get right than gold, for example, where too much back and forth can muddy the tones, while here alternating makes the copper richer, generally speaking. I'm highlighting all the edges that face up, and I highlight the area towards the lower edge so I can place shades on the area next to the brightest highlights. I was using pale lichen to create some verdigris around the copper, and I also used it to create scratches at the bottom of the shoulder guard. The desaturated green creates an interesting contrast against the more saturated green of the armor. I did not want to weather the green too much, because weathering and rust always competes with the highlights of an area and can ruin your contrast. I used the same copper recipe for the bale, starting with the same base coat color and then adding my interpretation of highlight patterns. I chose a very dark blue for the loincloth, highlighting it with a mix of turquoise and a warm off-white. Painting lines to mimic the structure of fabric and putting sharp highlights and edges to create a more contrasting pattern. I decided to also paint the shield in copper and to put a lot of emphasis on the three spherical shapes. Again, starting off of a deep red brown. You can see how I put down a more orange highlight first and then quickly decide that I want a bit more muted but higher valued highlights and added the skin tone. First I'm establishing the light on the volumes, then I make sure the colors and textures work. You can see here that I'm adding additional highlights by adding circular lines in a warm off-white. Actually, I did not check the way the shield goes on the miniature, and the highlights are slightly offset towards the light source I picked for the miniature, so always double check your sub-assemblies. In between I added a wash of the deep red to bring back some richness of the color. Then it was time to create additional reflections to the spheres. I made sure that one reflection was highlighted with a cold color to contrast the warm main highlight. I continued to highlight the rest of the copper. I also added the pale lichen dents that I did on the shoulder guards on the lower half of the shield to make everything more coherent. Unlike the green armor, I wanted to weather the copper shield significantly, so I cracked out a few turquoise shades and black and white to mix, and started to apply some selective washes of a dark turquoise to set up the weathering areas. I'm gradually adding lighter turquoise and cover less area. This is important to not make the effect unrealistic. Eventually I added white to the mix and applied some last dots to the weathered areas to finish the weathering. I did the same for the wooden area of the shield to simulate some spilling verdigris. I started the wood by adding a mix of English uniform and a bit of black. And you can see that I'm leaving out the deeper areas to have some shadows right away, and then I mixed in more and more ice yellow and highlighted the edges. And last I'm bringing back some of the shadows that got lost during highlighting. I wanted the heads on the gallows to stand out, so I shaped the last added head with big contrast before I added details like stitches and some fresh blood. The gallows sculpt was really plain, so I decided to add my own wood grain as a freehand. Then I painted the nails and metal parts and added rust and the last details. I decided to do the hammer in a dark base gray and gradually added highlights in a non-metallic metal pattern by just painting on texture with lighter highlight colors. I finally added rust effects to the darker areas and on the wood around the metal parts. Again, I made sure not to overdo the weathering to not obscure the previous painting effort. The metal spike on the shoulder started out as a medium gray-blue to which I gradually added warm highlights. Again, a line pattern resembling burnished metal. On top of that, I added the last highlights in an off-white and made sure the parts that were not reflecting were dark to maximize contrast. As a last step, I added a hint of rust with an orange-brown. For the base, I prepared some milliput standard and then bulked in some stones with cork that I would later sculpt over after I made sure the miniature would later fit on. It was definitely not the brightest idea to create the base after I painted almost all of the miniature, but it turned out fine. Typically I create the base before I start painting the miniature so I don't have to take care so much. I wanted a gnarly branch that fits the nurgle theme wrapping around these stones, but I didn't have a properly shaped root to use this time, so I started to twist together 2 lengths of wire. I added another length to make the branch a bit wider and didn't wrap it all the way, so I had the last bit stand out as a base for a smaller branch. Using a final, smaller gauge wire, I made sure the last part that was only made up out of 1 to this point also had some structure that the milliput could catch onto. Then I roughly covered the wire in milliput and pushed in some basic bark structures with a color shaper. I would end up painting in most of it anyway, like I did on the other wood parts. After I found a satisfying position for the branch, I started covering the rocks with milliput and added small rocks and additional detail. I base coated everything black again and mixed a very dark turquoise green which would fit the overall atmosphere, gradually going lighter on the mix. This was going to be a very cold base, but I wanted a bit of warmth in the shadows as contrast, so I mixed red and black and applied a few washes in the darker areas. Like I said initially, eventually time constraints caught up on me and I spent the last few hours painting off cam, but here is the result of what I did with the base. Basically I added more contrast and adjusted the temperature a bit more to fit the miniature. I also added a single oak leaf to the branch to add some tiny additional detail. And that's it. I'm really fond of the result, and even more so because I had so much fun while painting it. I hope everyone has as much fun while painting, and hopefully my videos can help you to step by step find the joy of painting as well. Voting starts on the 17th of August. If you want to vote for my entry on the Everchosen page, I will put a link in the description that you can follow. Thanks a lot if you do. I will make a follow-up video looking at all the entries and pick out my favorites, so smash like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future uploads. Stay creative and see you next video.